headed to the shoot now. You can see how narrow the roads are. It's a very beautiful area up here. I'd hate to make a mistake on these roads at night or after a storm. There are very particular lighting issues we're going to have to deal with today. We are frequently down low, and on a very humid day like today, again you can see the water hanging in the air. We have to be even more careful about the light. So, as I always do, but even more intensely than on a clear day, I'm watching in my mind, making the necessary calculations and adjustments as we're moving down the road, so that by the time we hit where we're going to be doing our first shoot, I will be well versed in every possible angle the sun's going to hit and the colors will shift, because I've been watching and plotting them all and storing that information. It may sound strange, but very much a part of what I do before a shoot and on my way. I find for me a lot of preparation occurs well before I show up. If it's an area where I've shot before, I'm still going to be very careful and very attentive prior to the shoot, because obviously every day, every environmental situation is completely different, unless you're shooting in a studio with strobes and you have absolute control. It's now approximately 20 after 7, and you can see that despite, again, the fact that it's dawn, or after dawn, it's still very dark and very gray, much more like dusk would have been yesterday. Well, this is the point at which I switched on as the car pulled right here. I'd already made a decision about what I was going to have to do. I knew that given the position of the sun relative to where we are and the mist and humidity, that's Lou by the way, that I'd have to ISO up unless I wanted to change my lens. I'm not a fan of ISOing up. I weighed the relative merits of that. I made a decision that in this case I'd much rather use the 24 to 105 because of the way the building looks, or the look I want from the building. I've already begun to build a 3D map in my head. I've imagined what the back of the building would be like, and generally when I can, before I start shooting, if I can, I'm going to take myself quickly around the building. I think it's important to be able to survey. See an old plow down there. What I'm going to put together, how I'm going to approach this strategically and effectively, manage my time and my effort. My goal is always to have a very high yield without taking several thousand photos in the process. And to do that, I have to make sure that I'm constantly in control. I like to keep myself 3 to 5 shots ahead. Most interesting. I'm particularly struck as I'm thinking about the facade on the front of the building versus the old log structure underneath it. I'm also aware of the fact that the grass is so wet from humidity that it's already soaking through my shoes. I'm going to have to watch out for that, particularly if it gets hot. And it will. Notice the 2 roofs. Well, I'm going to get to work. I'll be back shortly. I may still have to change lenses. I've got serious questions in my mind about how this lens will do on the back side of the building. Don't really want to go up to ISO 1600. Not happy with that trade-off. So, in my head, I'm running various scenarios about how best to deal with the situation. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my camera, frame the photograph, and then pull my depth of field. To the back of the house, and I'm looking around particularly at the sky. You should be able to see a little bit of blue coming through the clouds. That's a cause for concern largely because, as you know, when you ISO up and raise the ISO, you automatically increase the sensitivity of the camera to light. That's bothering me because if I'm not careful about my angles, I'm going to have hot spots that are going to cause a loss of detail. So I'm watching. I'm probably going to get a couple at this angle. I got a couple from the other angle looking back toward the fence behind me and noticed that the sky is very hot. Not a lot I can do. It may force me to change my lens. I'm weighing the possibilities in my head right now. May not look like much, but I'm fascinated by it. An old shoe, an interesting sort of out of place trash can or planter, pot. When I'm here in a situation like this, I'm very much, an odd way of looking at it, I suppose. It's the story of the life of the people who lived here that fascinates me. And as I'm choosing camera angles, as I'm looking at what I'm going to photograph, my focus is more on the sense of the people here, what their lives were like, how they lived, what they thought, and the remnants of that life. And as I'm choosing my angles and plotting my way of photographing the building, it's with that story in mind. Much more difficult here. I'd very much like to go into the building, but the building is not likely to be safe. But nonetheless, there are remnants everywhere. Spray cans. The interesting way in which this porch was added to the original house. Fascinating. It'll be interesting to see what we find when Andy edits this video. I'm actually inside the house. You can see Lou outside the door. In here, I've ISO'd up considerably, on the order of ISO 1600. I'm really not happy with that because any small hotspot becomes extremely hot extremely quickly. I also didn't want to set up flashes for the obvious reason that it would take time, and to some extent I would lose some of the flavor of being in here. So I'm storing that information away. I'm still processing and trying to determine how I would handle the situation the next time, short of going with a faster lens, something like the 16 to 35, which would give me the ability to go down to f2.8. Very interesting little rocker. And again, very much on my mind while I'm working in here is the story of the people who lived here. An old stove, spoons, human remains, aspects of human life, absolutely everywhere. I'm also struck by the juxtaposition of a light hanging from the 1950s, a fire extinguisher from the 1930s. I don't know if you can see it, but every single one of these beams has been numbered as though at some point someone were going to take this building apart and put it back together. Well, one more shot, and I think we're going to head off. One of the things I frequently do is I take my focal point at the end, and this point, in this case here, and then I shift my camera down, basically rotating my focal point, and I placed it there. That elongates the object, and I like that sense of being in the machinery. I do that often. Still struggling with ISO. I'm watching the clouds move quickly over my head. Out here I can shoot at an ISO of 200 now. Much more acceptable. Anyway, we're going to head down to a foundation that appears to be there. I want to get a few more photos here. I'm very intrigued by the lichen growing on the remains of the wheel. And I'm probably going to come at it from this angle because, again, I like that sense of space being stretched. Well, we're headed back to the car. And I confess this is a bit of a strange time for me. We have our 5-step methodology. Observe, engage, respond, create, detach. And for me, if you're wondering what I'm thinking, there's always that moment at the end in this case, longer moments that will linger. And I confess there's a certain sadness left behind as we leave pieces of a life. And I don't know how long this house will stand. As you can see, there is significant damage to the structure. Lou has noted that somewhere in the barn there appear to be the whiteboards from outside, or inside rather, stored and stacked, but I'm afraid it's too far gone. So I suppose, in one way, I haven't detached. Not yet. I think that part of what makes me think and work as a photographer, artist, whatever the appropriate adjective is that I'm not only open to what I'm feeling while I'm in the midst of taking photographs, but on days like today, I let it linger, or perhaps I don't have a choice but to let it linger. I'm not always sure what I'm feeling or why I feel it. I suppose here there's a certain sense of desolation, and as you look at some of the photographs I took, particularly from the inside with the light coming through the logs, that sense of emptiness, desolation, loss will be very much apparent. I think that as a photographer, particularly in the tradition of people like Eugene Smith, Avedon Parks, Cartier-Bresson, the essence of what we do is the emotion that we carry with us. And today in particular, the grayness of the sky, the brokenness of the building, all speak to me of loss and desolation and separateness. And now that I think about many of the photographs that I took today thus far, it was that feeling, that sense, that dominated what I did and how I approached the building. So before we leave, I'll just take a minute and just stand here in the silence, continue to absorb what I experienced.